I'm Karishma Magan, and I was one of the participants at the youth camp along with Irfan. And we just want to highlight the important things about the trip, like why we went, why did we decide to go even though Altaf was deported, the type of people we met on the camp, the occupation itself, which is very important, and discuss people of Palestinian descent and how they're affected by the 1940 Nakba. So Irfan, Laika and I decided to go to Palestine even though Altaf was deported because we felt that we shouldn't be deterred by the Israeli forces. If we do that, that would be giving up our power to them. And we felt that we had a purpose to go there and we had to conquer it. So we took the risk. We were all willing to take the risk. And we knew that we faced a higher risk of deportation than anyone else who was going. But we thought that it was worth it because we're all activists and we all support this cause and we do anything to support it. And Irfan will tell you more about the actual camp.
Okay, so as you know, I'm Irfaan Mangera, one of the delegates on the camp. Basically, the aim of the camp was to bring together young people from all over the world, activists, and surprisingly enough, a lot of people of Palestinian descent, which was an amazing experience for us because we learned a lot about the histories, etc. So the aim was to encourage respect and understanding of human rights for one another and how we can uphold human rights. It also sought to explore possible ways of twinning between different countries, similarly to how Johannesburg and Ramallah twinned up last year, and how the statue of Nelson Mandela got to Ramallah. Importantly, it sought to raise awareness about life in Palestine, about what the Palestinians go through, and what sort of how can we help the Palestinian people in their struggle for freedom. So we visited different cities in occupied Palestine, and through that we also saw different historic sites. We saw a refugee camp, we visited universities, which broadened our understanding of life there, especially as a student going to a university, speaking with other students, how their rights are restricted with regards to education, movement, not being able to, they miss a lot of exams and they miss a lot of, important work because of the Israeli occupation. That's basically the whole camp, and we'll discuss further on certain incidents and experiences.
I just want to highlight the type of people that Palestinians are. Everyone has a certain image that they're sad, they're down, they're depressed. No, that's completely incorrect. When we met Palestinians, all they did was dance, clap. They filled with so much of hope that we were all so surprised and taken aback by this. And I think their hope gave us so much of hope ourselves to carry this forward. And we spoke to one of the Palestinian guys, his name was Fayed. He's the most beautiful person you will ever meet. And he said that us Palestinians, we have hope. We have hope that we will be free one day and we will never let go of this. They can take everything but our dignity. And I think that was really, really important.
Meeting Palestinians was like the most important thing for us, so that we can establish sort of relationships and build on work that they do and that we can do for them. A close friend of mine, Mahmoud, a personal story of his was he had a spinal injury, and he had to go to Jordan every time for checkups and medical attention. So going through Jordan is not easy as we think it is. There's a lot of checkpoints also. The Israeli checkpoint specifically has a lot of scanners, and there's a lot of Israeli military presence there. So after his whole operation and the medical treatment, he has to go now and again to meet family for checkups and so on. Because he has a metal plate in his back, he always gets stopped at the Israeli checkpoint, and he waits there for hours because the Israelis don't want him to go through. Then the same thing with the others, because they fear that, there's a lot of, how do you put it? There's a lot of change between the people. And then they don't like external bodies to come in and out. They want to constrict the Palestinian people so that, they are limited in all that they have, resources and, meeting other people. And that was a key thing for us, building on those relationships, etc.
So in order for Palestinians in the West Bank to go to Jerusalem, they need a permit from the Israelis. And this is hardly ever given to them. So my one friend, Renat, her family was living in Jerusalem. And she didn't have an ID or permission to go to Jerusalem from the West Bank because she was studying in the West Bank. And so on this trip, when we had to go to Jerusalem, we had to leave the Palestinian participants at the hostel and go without them because the Palestinian authorities couldn't get authority and permission for them to cross the checkpoint. And that was a really emotional moment for everyone because you had to leave all your friends behind. Us as foreigners, we could go and see Al-Aqsa Mosque, the churches, etc. But they all who live in Palestine and have never seen Jerusalem couldn't go. And we stood for 5 minutes and everyone was just crying because of how emotional that whole experience was. But two of our friends decided to risk it. They said if they get to the checkpoint and they check, they'll willingly go back, but they have to try. So we all got into the bus, including those two, and we got to the checkpoint. Everyone stood still. We sent all the white people to the front, obviously, to make it seem as if this is a legit bus going through. And as soon as we passed the checkpoint, everyone started screaming out of excitement because they made it through. And this was one of my friend's first times going to Jerusalem. So it was a really special moment for him. And my friend was really excited to see her family after so long. So that was a pretty emotional day for all of us.
We know the importance of Masjid al-Aqsa, and it's our third holiest site in Islam. For us being denied access, well, not for us, for the Palestinians being denied access, it felt so disheartening. You could actually feel the sorrow and the pain they felt when Masjid al-Aqsa or Jerusalem was just mentioned to them. And, it brought tears to all of our eyes because we could not bear that pain that they felt. Their eyes were lit up, they were red, and, it felt, it was just like agony because they were, they haven't ever seen the Jerusalem, ever. And they're born in that land. They're denied access of movement. They can't go there. They need special permissions, which is most of the time denied. That alone, changed my whole view of occupied Palestine. It really opened us to a whole new dimension of what it's like there. Building on that, look, the infrastructure in Jerusalem itself, it was quite surprising. On the one end, you have the Palestinian side where, there's a lot of garbage and there's no real transport system. There's a lot of taxis around. The buildings also, it's not state of the art or something that, is modern or something of the sort. And when we got onto the taxi coming back home, we drove through the other part of Jerusalem, the Israeli part. And what we saw there was, chalk and cheese. The transport systems were, state of the art. You had buses running almost every minute. You had, these trams, these new modern trams going. You had buildings, you had shopping malls, centers that are, lit up in bright lights. And, to see the differences between the two, it was, shocking for us to bear because it's literally divided by a street. And for us, it was simply unimaginable.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a story about what one of the groups from the camps experienced. So we were split into groups. We went to Nablus, another group went to Jenin, and another group went to Salfit. So the group who went to Salfit, they experienced Israeli forces firsthand. So there's a man who lives right by the apartheid wall, which means that if he has visitors, he had to get permission for visitors to come into his house because they had to enter and exit through the wall. It was also very difficult for him because he had to go through the checkpoint on a daily basis to enter and exit his home, to go to work, to take his kids to school, etc. And when the bus arrived, him and his wife offered 40 of the participants to enter into his home, and they made them tea. And when they walked out, Palestinian forces just started coming towards them, so they all ran to the bus. And what they witnessed was that the Israeli forces handcuffed a Palestinian man, put him in his own car, and started driving his own car. So they basically kidnapped him in his own car. So everyone was really shocked by that incident. And there was absolutely no reason. He wasn't doing anything prior to that. So everyone was really confused at that point.
Aside from that, Palestinians are limited in many other things. The way they build their buildings, the way they go about their lives. So in the instance of Ramallah, the highest building is about 20 odd stories or 20 stories. They can't build more than that because it's a threat to Israeli settlements. The settlements are all over, and they always, most of the time, they're overlooking Palestinian cities or towns. The one thing to note also was like the water issue. You have all the Palestinian homes that are, they have these, like the JoJo tanks we have here in South Africa on the roofs. And on the Israeli end, there's nothing. So they have functioning water systems, whereas the Palestinians hardly get the same amount of water. They have to store that water. So the settlements are really, they're built on illegal land. And in Hebron, it's even worse because the settlement is actually in the city itself, which makes it so difficult for Palestinians to live because they face torment, they face, daily discrimination and, attacks on their dignity, basically. What happened was at the Ibrahimi Mosque, we had to go through checkpoints as well. And these checkpoints are not just open. There's not a security guard like we have here. They're manned by Israeli soldiers who carry heavy weaponry, who carry full body armor. And how do you live in a place like this? This was shocking for us. I mean, this is a place of prayer. This is a place where we're supposed to go. It's a place of, spiritual upliftment. So how do we then, change this? The occupiers continue to torment Israeli people, Palestinian people. There's another story about the Palestinians who lived on the Shuhada Street, but we didn't get the opportunity to go there. However, we learned a lot from our friends who live in that area about how they had to actually place a lot of protective covering over the marketplace because they would be thrown at with different things, and how it's unimaginable.
So on the topic of Hebron, in the Ibrahimi Mosque, it's divided into the Jewish side and a Muslim side. So the Jewish side is only open to everyone 7 days of the year, and the Muslim side, anyone could enter. And during, when the Azan plays, the Israelis like to go around screaming rude Arabic words and throwing things at people. So that's pretty disrespectful. Another thing about Hebron, on the Shahada Street, the things that they throw at the Palestinians, for example, one of the things was acid. So a lot of kids have been burnt with acid because Israelis throw it from the top onto the market space where a lot of kids walk around. We're going to discuss the refugee camps? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to discuss the refugee camp that we saw in Ramallah. So these refugees came from places like Tel Aviv, which is now occupied by Israel, and they moved into these refugee camps. It was first set up with tents, and because people were unable to leave, it became a more permanent structure, so they decided to build buildings. So they couldn't build horizontally, they had to build up and up and up. So all the houses are really close together, so there's hardly any spacing because it's becoming overpopulated. They started off with a minimal amount of people, and it just kept expanding. So you have a land which is structured and a population which is just continuously expanding. And you can just imagine how an overpopulated space makes life hard to live in. So all the electricity cables are outdated. So people in the refugee camps hardly have electricity. The water is polluted and unusable, so they're unable to use water in the daily lives. Education and electricity is provided by the UN, but one of the girls who's from there said that it's of a really poor quality. So they're unable to rely on these education systems because it's of a low standard. Another thing is that sometimes they have curfews in the refugee camps, and if you're caught with your head outside the window after a certain time, they would shoot you without any warning first. They also have, at night, like most nights, every night or every second night, Israeli forces just invade the refugee camps and they arrest mainly youth for absolutely no reason. So around the refugee camps, they have pictures of people who were arrested. They have pictures of martyrs. And one of the martyrs was a 13 or 17-year-old boy called Laik. And he witnessed one of the buildings being burnt next to him. So he got really upset, and in his anger, he went to protest outside a checkpoint in Ramallah. And unfortunately, he was shot and killed by the Israeli forces. So his face was painted all over the refugee camps, and this is done in order to keep the spirit alive, to remind the people what they're facing every day, to keep them angry so that they can carry on.
So in the refugee camps, what they do, the IDF resorts to a thing called collective punishment. Now with collective punishment, it's, if you do something, your whole family faces the brunt of that. Whether it's, protesting peacefully, the whole family will literally have to face that brunt. And that's a difficult thing for Palestinians living there, because what they do is, for example, if you're living in a building, a specific room, they'll blow up that whole room, leave it in with rubble or whatever, and then that family has to relocate somewhere within that refugee camp. So they all face the same torment. If one person does it, or if one person is jailed, the whole family has to face that the consequences of that. And yet they do it. They're resilient. The Palestinians are, fighters. They're resilient, and really, it's inspiring to see their motivation and their will that one day they will be free and they will keep on fighting. I'd like to discuss now the whole governing system that's sort of in place in the West Bank. We have different areas. So we have Area A, B, and C. In Area A, we have the Palestinian Authority. There's a government. The Palestinian vote for the government in charge, and they rule those cities or those areas. However, the Israeli forces come in there freely, and they can do as they wish. Area B is governed by both the Palestinian Authority as well as the Israeli security forces. So there's a lot of checkpoints. There's a lot of additional security presence there. Area C is fully Israeli controlled. It's run by the Israeli government, and there's Israeli security forces everywhere. Now, with this, the population continues to grow with the settlers, and more and more land is lost on the daily for the Palestinian people. All of this is happening inside illegal land, and there's many UN resolutions, there's international breaches of human rights, of the whole settlement itself, from the Oslo Accords to what's the other ones? So the Geneva Conventions, international terrorism, the UN Security Council. So all of this is a breach from the Israeli government and people. And it continues to grow. From 2010, there were about 1,545 settlements. And in 2015, well, every year it grew. So in 2011, there were 1,800 that new that sprung up. 2012, 1,500 that grew, that sprung up, and each year it grew by 1,000. However, in 2014, almost 3,000 settlements were sprung up in the Palestinian territories. So land is restricted by the wall and by Israeli settlements. Almost 46% is under Israeli control at the moment, and 54 by the Palestinians. However, with that 54, it's also under occupation. There's restriction of movement and all sorts of things. So the settler population has grown from 229,500 people in 1995 to 597,600 people in 2015. So you can imagine the amount of Israelis coming into Palestinian land and taking up Palestinian land.
As we were driving from the airport to Jericho, we passed a lot of settlements. And each settlement has its own sign and an animal allocated to it to show that they have power, they have control. And animals that are used are wolves or lions or like animals such as that to show that this is theirs and this is their territory. Yeah, it's under their own rule. The Israeli settlers have a lot of free reign. They go around burning houses, taking over the land. They make life living hell for Palestinians so that they would move out of where they currently are so that Israeli settlers could move in. And what you see, Israeli settlers usually take like the top of the mountain because they see it as more secure than being at the bottom, so that it's more of a security protocol. But at the bottom of the mountain, you'd see a bunch of shacks where Palestinians are living. And you can just imagine like the torture and torment that they go through on a daily basis to deal with the Israeli settlers who are just above them and who are constantly trying to get them to move out. So Palestinians are really cultured people, extremely cultured. There wasn't a moment on the bus where we would sit down. They would always be doing the dubka, they'd be clapping, they'd be singing Palestinian songs with such pride. And it was such a beautiful thing to see such patriotism from the Palestinians, even though so many people and places and countries and authorities don't recognize them as a state. For example, they still take Jerusalem as their capital city, even though it's the capital of Israel, which is quite interesting. And they've been using spaces as temporary spaces. For example, they use Ramallah as a political capital, but only temporarily, because they have hope that everything will be moved to Jerusalem once they're free.
The culture and, it's very vast, from the foods to the music and all sorts of things. But, the character is something that we need to highlight, is that Palestinians are such a great character. Meeting ordinary Palestinians or having ordinary conversations with them was something amazing to witness. Their respect for human dignity, for other religions, other cultures, it's immense. I mean, in Palestine itself, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have visitors from other faiths, you have the Samaritans, which are actually Jewish, and they don't agree with Israel and the Zionist lobby. So we know that the Palestinians are respectful of all people, regardless of your color, creed, nationality, doesn't matter. They just want freedom. They just want to live in freedom and without being under occupation, without having to go through the hardships that they do. And I think for us, it's imperative that we continue to fight and we continue to do as much work as we can.
So also with their culture, the reason that they're dancing all the time, they're happy, they're smiling, they have a positive attitude. One of our friends said that if they're surrounded by death and sadness every day, if they're negative about life, what do they have left? So they have to continuously find something to be happy about.
As a student, visiting the university as well as one of the key aspects for me. We met up with like the student council. We met up with activists from the university, and it's surprising to note how the Palestinians undergo raids and undergo, it's a restriction of their education. They have a campaign now. It's the Right to Education, which seeks to free themselves from the occupation and allow education to happen freely. And education should be free. It shouldn't be restricted. You shouldn't be disallowed from certain courses or subjects, etc. So there are many arrests. Those in council of Berzit University, all the presidents have been jailed thus far. The one currently in office in his term, he is active. However, he is also restricted as to what he does and where he goes. So he's also, on the radar for Israeli police. What's another parallel we can draw is with South Africa and our student movement, and how it's important for youth to take a stand, and important for youth to make the change, because ultimately it's us who are who are going to live in the future, and we're going to lead the future. And many Palestinians believe that there's hope for them, but it's not going to come from the current government. It's going to come from the young people.
Also, in terms of universities, a lot of the students from the refugee camps lose a lot of semesters. So one of our friends told us a story about how he failed 2 semesters and had to repeat the year because Israeli forces came every night and invaded his home. So that was very traumatizing for him, and he couldn't study every night because they'd be in his home. And he said when he was a kid, he was about 9 years old, the Israeli forces were invading the refugee camp, and because his home is at the top, they had to come through from the roof. So they broke through the roof and came down with their guns. And him as a 9-year-old standing there, or any 9-year-old who experiences that, that's not normal. That's traumatic, and it's not good for your upbringing. So they wanted to arrest his dad at that point. And as a 9-year-old, all he could do was latch onto his dad's leg and say, don't take my dad, don't take my dad. And so that's the kind of trauma that kids experience every day. You just feel helpless. Like even him as a dad, as his dad, probably felt so helpless because there's nothing that he could do to comfort his own son from that entire situation, because it happens on a daily basis. Also at the university, there was he spoke about collective punishment. So in that area, there was collective punishment, and they had a 10-day curfew. So students weren't allowed to go to universities, people weren't allowed to go out of their homes, and that really brought back the entire academic year. So that affected so many students in so many ways.
It was actually months.
Oh yeah, it was 3 months, sorry. It started off as 10 days and then prolonged for 3 months.
For us personally, I think although it's an eye-opener, it's, facing it firsthand has been one of, some of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. And it's also detrimental to our well-being. I mean, from when we left, we were under a lot of anxiety. We knew that we were going to face some sort of security and, oppression from the Israeli forces. And for a young person, it's not good for us to endure such things. It's traumatic for us. So mentally and physically, we were drained. I think for the whole first 2 days, we were quite shocked and worked up, especially also hearing about Leica. I couldn't eat, and Karishma also was really, concerned and worried that, what happens to Leica. So for that whole first 2 days, we were, in this new world, in this new dimension where we couldn't grasp that we made it, and also that, our friend is still in detention. So it was a really traumatic experience for us as well.
The friends we made of Palestinian descent, one of our friends, Layla, her grandfather was from Palestine, and in the 1940 Nakba, he had to leave because he was at risk of being killed. So he got onto any ship he could find, but he had to stay at the bottom of the ship because if they found him, he'd be killed. So the conditions were really bad, and he had no idea where he was going to. And he landed up in Argentina, where he got married, they started a life, etc. But I just want to highlight how this led to a loss of culture and a loss of religion, because in Argentina there were no mosques. So the family didn't want to practice Islam anymore because they didn't have a place of prayer, and they wanted a strong relationship with God. So they decided to just convert into Christianity. And they lost their entire culture, their religion, their tie with Palestine, and all they had was stories from their grandparents to live off. And for them, coming to Palestine was a real eye-opener. They felt so honored, and like they could reattach themselves to Palestine. So I think there's probably a lost generations out there because of the 1948 Nakba. And I think that that's a really important thing to highlight as well.
And, we're speaking about them being the diaspora and being in Jordan and elsewhere. There's so many Palestinians living abroad in other countries, in Europe, like Germany and Finland, and going down to South America. There are many living there. Like she mentioned, Argentina, Colombia, from Mexico. And when they came, some of them actually got to meet their families, and they were so, it was such a moment for them that they didn't have words to explain the feeling that they felt. We could see from, as an external body that, it meant something to them. And having worked through, coming through the embassies elsewhere, it shows that there is, there is potential for us to build on these, these movements and campaigns. And if we do it in a coordinated fashion, we might just be effective in getting rid of the Israeli occupation.
Speaking about solidarity, well, when we were speaking to all of our friends about the campaigns and structures that they have in place to support Palestine, we had, as South Africa, we had the strongest organizations in place. And everyone came to ask us, like, explain how NC4P, BDS, PSC, PSA, how everything works, and they want to mirror all of this. So I think it's important, like, to lend our ideas and how our organizations work to other countries, because they don't have as much of a support base as we do in South Africa. For example, in Germany, they didn't want to take the national BDS ideology. They wanted to start their own BDS movement, where they identify with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that's not what BDS was about. So we need to start working with other countries and create relations between different solidarity movements, or help them create these solidarity movements so that we can have a larger international presence, because that's really important.
Building on the international work that we mentioned, the Palestinians feel that we as the international community have failed them to an extent, because the call for ending the armed struggle came from the international community, and they listened. Then they went into a period of negotiations, and that also failed. So now what's left for them to do? I mean, how do they live a life of self-determination where they can, live freely of occupation? What do they do when this whole entire thing was created by international parties, and now they left without that support? So for us, it's rebuilding on our campaigns, becoming more effective and coordinated so that we can, drive the Israelis out of the occupied lands and then work towards peace and justice for all Palestinians. We are indebted to the Palestinian people, and I think we must remain unapologetic in our support for them. It is our hope as young activists to have learned as much as we can from this trip so that we can, carry out these campaigns more effectively and continue with the International Solidarity Campaign. The best for us was being around so many different people from around the world who had ties to Palestine and who have Palestine at heart and are fighting within their communities and their organizations. And, you know, the whole thing about the international youth camp is that you learn so much about not just the Palestinian cultures and, you know, a way of life, but about other people's. And I think that's key for us because we all can learn from one another and how, you know, best we can do things and implement things. And that for me was the best experience. On the other hand, the worst experience was, I won't say worst to an extent, because in Masjid al-Aqsa or Jerusalem itself, you know, you had the, you know, you felt this pain, you felt this emotion that I haven't ever felt before. And you felt that the pain and the agony of my fellow Palestinian friends. And, you know, I was brought to tears just before I left, when I was at the mosque also. You know, I couldn't bear that feeling. It was just so emotional. And for me, praying at that mosque was, you know, something special. So it was a mixture of the two.
For us, just being in Palestine was the best experience. It was such a far-fetched dream for all of us. Like, we didn't think it was ever viable. And actually having this opportunity and being there was so surreal. And the worst experience was obviously leaving all my friends behind and going and seeing places that they should be able to see.